If we look at the history of race, really it's the history of colonialism.
Race, a four-letter word that can determine your quality of life, social, and economic status. From Michael Jackson's Black or White to political commentators.
This is about racism. This is about racial profiling. And this is about a community that's trying to find its voice.
Race is a prevalent topic in today's society. Is race a biological reality or a fabricated social construct? I met with Dr. Saul, a sociology professor at IUPUI, to answer my questions.
Of course, the question of whether or not race is biological is a big question, and actually, it's a question that people are still working on today. There are certain things that are relatively settled, but we've got new science of genetics, which actually adds all sorts of interesting new things to our knowledge. The primary answer is that yes, there are genetic markers for things that we associate with race. So there are genetic markers for skin color, there are genetic markers for hair texture that we can group people by. What is not biological is all the social meanings we've attached to that, right? We've decided that as collectively over hundreds of years, we've sort of decided that these are the particular differences that are meaningful as opposed to other differences. Human beings vary on all sorts of different measures. We vary based on height, right? But we don't think height is a socially significant difference, right? We don't say your height determines what you can do in life besides, I don't know, play basketball, right? It does, but we don't think that that's a socially meaningful difference. So of course there are genetic markers that are associated with race, but how we use those is largely determined by history and by sort of our current social constellation. So, the quick and easy answer is there's not any one particular person that decided that to group people based on skin color. If we look at the history of race, really it's the history of colonialism. So when white Europeans began to explore the world, they began to see people who looked different from them, and that's really important. Not necessarily because of what they found, but because it changed how they started understanding themselves. So instead of being instead of being only Frenchmen and Portuguese and Englishmen, they started seeing themselves as a category, as European. And this is really the birth of whiteness, right? The idea that white was a category, that European was a category. And at the same time, this contributed to the grouping of people from other continents as well. Lumping all Asians together and saying they're Asian, and of course, Japanese and Chinese didn't think of themselves as one group, right? Actually, for a long time, they didn't think of themselves as being some part, some Asian group. And that was really a product of colonialism. The best example of this is actually, if we think of the Americas, before Columbus discovered America, there were hundreds of tribes of native peoples, and they had very different languages. They were sometimes at war with each other, sometimes not at war with each other, but they had very different customs and systems of governments and culture and things like this. But when settlers started to arrive, when colonizers started to arrive in the Americas, they said, well, you're all American Indians. And that wasn't an identity that American Indians had, right? And so that was really the kind of spark for race. Now, how it took on the particular meanings that it has in the United States, is related to American history. So our primary fault line, you might say, our big dividing line in the United States is between white and black, and the construction of black identity and blackness as race is really all about the history of slavery. The idea that because Africans had these very visible markers, we could exploit them. Europeans could exploit people who were far from their home, who were visibly different, and force them into a class that was entirely and completely separate from whites. And it wasn't that way at first. When the first slaves arrived in America, there were African slaves, but there were also indentured servants who were white, from Ireland and other places. But eventually, these indentured servants were able to turn their status from one of slavery into one of a freed person. Whereas African Americans were not able to do this. Slaves from Africa were not able to sort of become free. They weren't able to buy their freedom in the same way that white slaves were, and this really created a permanent fault line, a permanent line between black and white in America. And this is actually really important, and it's really important not just because the whites were able to become free, but because whites began to see themselves as part of the same category as the rich, even though their lives were much more similar to, at the time, much more similar to black slaves than it was to rich whites. They began to affiliate themselves more closely with rich whites than they did with enslaved blacks, which further created this divide, right? This social divide, which had the effect not just of thinking of somebody as a separate category, right? That's one thing, but also of thinking of that category as somehow sort of inferior or even subhuman. You look at the justifications for slavery at the time. A lot of them were based on the idea that black Africans were not human in the same way that the way that white Europeans were, and that ideology really that very strong belief in the separateness of black and white is really a legacy of the economic system of slavery, primarily. So white privilege is a concept that a lot of people have been using, for the last 20 years or so. White privilege has been a big one way of particularly framing race relations in the United States. I think it's a valuable perspective. White privilege is the idea that despite any other disadvantages one might have in life, and of course there are other kinds of privilege besides racial privilege. There's class privilege and gender privilege and all these things. But just despite all the disadvantages or advantages one might have in life, that one receives privilege by virtue of the color of one's skin, despite all of these other things. And I think the biggest, we can give some examples of things like that. For instance, that when white people walk into a store, they're usually not followed around by security. Whereas when African Americans walk into a store, they're likely to be, they're not likely to, well, likely to be. I don't know. I'm gonna hedge. They're more likely to be followed around by the store owner. Or to take another example, white people are very rarely asked where they're from. Whereas somebody who looks Asian or Latino is often asked, where are you from? And then when they say, Detroit, people don't believe them. So to give an example, my husband is an immigrant. He's from Ukraine, but he has no accent, and he's white. And people ask him, where are you from? And he says, I'm from Milwaukee. And nobody ever questions that, right? In fact, even when he says, well, I was born in Ukraine, but I'm from Milwaukee, people are like, oh yeah, that makes sense that you're from Milwaukee. For people who look Asian or Latino, that question is a lot of times people don't accept that answer of Milwaukee or Detroit or whatever you might say, and we might not think of that as a privilege. But it is, right? Because this is forcing people to account for themselves in some way, a burden that people with white skin don't necessarily have to take on. They don't have to account for their differentness, their otherness, and that's a big part of white privilege. And I think this is really, for me, and people take different things out of this conversation of privilege. But for me, the real sort of privilege of being white is that whites never have to think about race, or very rarely have to think about race, because we're seen as the norm. We're seen as the ones who the benchmark for everyone else. And so we don't ever need to account for ourselves. We don't ever need to speak as if we're representatives of our race. Nobody ever says, hey, what's the white perspective on this to a white person? But I see it all the time. What's the black perspective to black people all the time? I see this happen in my classes. I try not to do it myself, but I certainly do see it happen. And that's, it's a burden to have to think and talk about race all the time. And it's definitely a privilege to be sort of seen as the norm and the benchmark off of which everybody else is judged. And I think, to me, that's kind of the heart of white privilege.
Race has been a catalyst for many social issues and movements throughout history. We have given it such an importance when it is only a social construct society can look past.